Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, and TGIF, as a matter of fact. I could really use a weekend. Doesn't really matter. It's coming, whether I could use it or not. Friday, June 30th, 2023. Time for another show. Time for another month, starting tomorrow. But, of course, we won't be on the air. I guess we join you on July 3rd. And then July 4th comes on a Tuesday, which, we were just talking about this around the house yesterday. It's a little bit weird to have it in the middle of the week. I mean, it happens all the time, but I don't know. We always think of it as weekend time, and of course, lots of businesses closed. I wonder a lot of people are going to get Monday off as well and make a 4-day weekend. I don't know. I'm not sure why the holiday to go blow things up for independence and liberty, of course. So there is that. But at any rate, that's coming up, an exciting time in our summers, etc. Getting ready for the new month. It doesn't mean that much other than that. But, what's today? Well, John Shiflett is on the job, of course. So not only is he busy telling you that the show has begun, and I assume he's telling you because I already know. And anyway, but also has the day of the day. What would be a good term for doing that? What international or national day is it today? I like the ones when it's national something I like to eat that's being given out for free day. But today is International Asteroid Day. Damn sight better than International Hemorrhoid Day, I can tell you that. And International Asteroid Day, all asteroids I think are inherently international by nature, but International Asteroid Day aims to raise public awareness about the asteroid impact hazard. So there it is, now you know. And to inform the public about the crisis communication actions to be taken at the global level in case of a credible near-Earth object threat. All right. It's certainly more useful eventually, I guess, or just as it addresses a more pressing concern than, say, National Ice Cream Day, which I'm sure is fantastic. I don't think they're giving away any free asteroids today, but you never know. I guess it's entirely possible. Maybe there are some asteroids for sale as private land holdings. That's a thing now, I imagine, or it should be. Or I could sell it on the internet if I really hustled. There you go. That's finally the premium we need to boost Patreon subscriptions to the Kagro in the Morning Show. We'll sell you an asteroid as private property, or at least allege that we are doing that. Until we're, dragged into court. But who would have competent jurisdiction? I wonder. A lot of private islands being sold. I've discovered that as we plan a vacation. I have to remind you that in July I do have a break scheduled, and I have not yet decided exactly how I will handle it, or whether I will just simply take the time off and say either, there's the rerun route, and there's the find something else to do for a week route. I don't know. I could use a break at some point. But at any rate, it's not that difficult to prepare a couple of reruns and take a look back at what was happening 1 year, 2 years, 3, 5. We have a number of options of years ago or just dates at random, I suppose. But where we're going, there's a lot of private island ownership today. And the private island ownership thing is on my mind for another reason as well. Shall we just follow the stream of consciousness and do that? So a number of private islands owned in this area that we're going to an area of the Bahamas. As it turns out, I like to pick vacation spots mostly by saying, it doesn't look like there's anything here in this ocean. I should zoom in on Google Maps and see if there are any fly specks of land out there that we can go to and relax at or whatever, or visit, or is there someplace you would ordinarily otherwise never find yourself? And the usual limitation there is, you never find yourself there because it's too hard to get there, and I don't have the resources to put into making 4-day treks, intermodal transportation treks to some island on which there's no infrastructure when you get there. But anyway, I like to do that, or just follow a road until it ends and then say it hits the water. Is there anything across the water? Let me go there. That's how I ended up at lovely Prince Edward Island, Ricky, at one point. In case you're interested about that, that was in 1993. There was not yet the bridge to PEI. And I was like, well, what happens if we just keep driving north up 95 until we hit the end of the country? And then what happens if we just keep driving up even further, like Canada? Why let that stop us, right? Eventually, though, there's water at the end of Canada on the other end. What's this? Look at that. There's an island there. It's not a fly speck. It's a sizable island. But and at the time, I had either never heard of it or never really knew that I had heard of it. Afterwards, of course, we find out it's a fairly famous place, mentioned in literature, Anne of Green Gables, etc. But I wasn't a big reader of that one. But that's how we ended up on PEI. Beautiful. Everyone should go. We had a great time. It's been a million years since we were there, but it was fantastic and fun. And this time I stuck a pin in I went the other direction. And anyway, we're going to the Bahamas, to which I think I've made a stop there once, but never actually made a vacation to the Bahamas, even after hearing for many years on my television and radio that it was better in the Bahamas. I never went. And now I'm on my way. And we're going to be going to, it's a collection of islands, the Exumas, I guess, and not eczema like the skin disease, but Exuma Islands. And there's one tremendous one in the middle. It's not tremendous. It's bigger than the others. But apparently a lot of those tiny islands are privately owned. And now, as it turns out, they're privately owned by a bunch of Hollywood movie stars and the like, mega millionaires and such. And I guess Johnny Depp owns one because they filmed the Pirates of the Caribbean, or Caribbean, however you pronounce it, from wherever you might be from, down there. And I guess he just really loved it and said, I'll just buy a place here. And that sounds nice to be able, A, to be able to do that, and B, sounds like it's beautiful. And then it turns out, as I was searching around for, all right, so I don't really want that many things to do there. I just want to kind of go there, and that'll be it. And searching around, though, for a few things that might be of interest to see, I noticed that there was a pin on Google Maps about this one, and I thought, well, is this right? This can't be right. Are they doing another one? Or was that must be it. This must be the place where they had, because the pin said Fire Festival. You remember that awful debacle of a hoax of a music festival of some kind that ended up all over the news, mostly because a bunch of rich weirdos who I guess thought they were going to the new Coachella or Burning Man type festival all flew down there for this very hyped on social media music festival, having been guaranteed luxury accommodations and gourmet dining and whatnot among the music festival. And then, of course, none of that materialized. They have luxury accommodations on the island. It's not a barren island, but they just didn't organize any of it correctly. Anyway, if you remember that debacle, it turns out to be quite near to where we are going, and so that adds an extra fun dimension. I'm going to go, except this time I'm going to actually have accommodations when I arrive, and also I have no real expectations for gourmet food either. But I understand the island cuisine is quite fun and low key and casual the way it ought to be. All right, so that sounds like fun. And I was reminded of private islands also because, do you remember the story I read you? Of course you do. A couple of days ago, because it was just a couple of days ago, and you're not having that sort of memory problem, about the Florida man, of course, the Lieutenant Colonel Florida man, who very recently was in the news for having unloaded 30 rounds from his AR-15 at his pool man, except he says he didn't realize it was his pool cleaning man. And that's getting a lot of attention now. It's getting coverage everywhere. It's the sort of story that gets picked up and repeated and commented. Anyway, the Tampa Bay Times has an additional write-up on it, and one of my fine friends who I was following on Mastodon had picked up on this story and repeated it. And it has a little extra detail in terms of, actually more detail about why the guy is completely ridiculous. and violated all, and how he violated all the firearm safety rules. So as we know, he fired 30 rounds from within just a few feet, apparently, of this person that he claims he did not recognize, and he probably didn't because it was probably dark. But again, that violates the "do you know what you're shooting at" rule. And then 30 rounds from within just a few feet. And the AR-15 thing, people are always saying, well, why do we need these weapons of war? What's wrong with handguns, or for that matter, a baseball bat for self-defense? And they always say, well, the rifles are a lot easier to aim and control with accuracy. You get a lot better accuracy with the rifles than you do with the handguns. And I don't know. I mean, I guess not. This guy sprayed his bullets all over the place. I don't know how accurate he had to be, or whether accuracy could have played a role in things, because as it turns out, for most of the time that he was shooting, the guy was nowhere in the neighborhood. I mean, or nowhere in the area of where he was shooting anyway. So, interesting story in that respect. Let's see. The Tampa Bay Times tells the story. We've heard most of it. This time we have names, by the way. If you are in, what's the name of this town? Dunedin? Dunedin? Dunedin. Floridians can tell me how that's pronounced. I have no idea. I've not run into that one. I don't know where it is. I could look it up, but the main idea here is this other stuff. That Jana and Bradley Hocevar, maybe? Hocevar, were watching a movie at their home. I'd like to know what movie. Probably Look Out, They're Coming to Invade Your House, or something like that, at about 9 p.m. on June 15th. So, I don't know how dark it was, but it was dark enough that the guy decided to go get a flashlight. And I did remember that we have it reversed, that in the summer, the days are longest to the north. So I guess maybe Florida doesn't have quite as much daylight. Like in the northern part of the country, 9 p.m. on June 15th, it's still kind of light in some places. But maybe not in Florida, or at least not in Dunedin. I wish I knew how that was pronounced. Not that I don't know what I would do with knowing how that was pronounced, but anyway, Jana and Bradley Hocevar, I don't know how that's pronounced either, were watching this movie at their home, and Jana heard noises coming from their blank. What? This is the match game. Where were they hearing noises coming from? I read the story the other day. This is how this relates to private islands. You're never going to believe this. This is how, it's a miracle I can do shows about news when I'm distracted by everything else in the world. They heard noises coming from their blank. The story I read you the other day had this same word, and I said, oh, that must be a typo, because I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Noises, and I read it to you as noises coming from their land. L-A-N-D, land. But no, now I guess I've now become convinced. Well, now I'm totally convinced because I looked it up. But how could the Tampa Bay Times make the same mistake? Did they just grab the other paper's thing? And then, no, that can't be it. Lanai. It's a thing. It's a word. I don't know how it's pronounced. Lanai. No idea. But once I saw that reproduced in the Tampa Bay Times, I had to look it up and say, all right, well, what the hell is this thing? So I went to look it up, and the problem was that the first thing that came up was that Lanai is actually a place name. It is an island in the Hawaiian archipelago, and it didn't show me anything else. Okay, well, I'm aware of now the fact that there is such an island, and as it turns out, well, for one thing, to connect the dots, it's mostly privately owned. So there's the private island thing. That's why this was on my mind. Now it's all revealed. What a mess my brain is. But this is where this comes up. All right, and there's a pronunciation guide at Wikipedia. Lanai, I guess, is the stress is on the first syllable. Or Lanai. Lanai. Well, the stress seems to be on the first syllable here. Oh no, that's right. It's on the second. I can see now. If I enlarge the type, if I can take my CPAP off and enlarge the type and get my cane and walk over here. By the way, yes, that was not a big hit. The CPAP attack at home. But at any rate, Lanai. Okay, yeah, I see. the stress marker for the which syllable the stress gets comes in the front, not in the back like an accent mark. But okay, anyway, Lanai is in fact a smallish island in Hawaii. And what they have in Florida there is it is a style of it's a porch, essentially, a roofed porch. I had no idea. I've never run into this thing. How have I never heard that word before? What am I, Hawaiian?
No, it's a common word.
And common in Florida is downstairs. So is that a lanai? That patio that's under the deck? Does that count as a lanai? I don't know. How have I never heard that word? I've never built a lanai here in this townhouse. So I've never heard that word before. And also, I guess I would just largely say, I don't care about that. I like landscaping design. I would say I would like a roofed porch, something like that. But I've never run into the fact that it was called a lanai. Well, there it is. The noise was coming from their lanai, not from inside the house, from outside the house, sort of, because lanais are considered a sort of indoor-outdoor living space. And apparently the definition is that it have a finished floor, and usually it has a roof, but it has one, wall open to the elements. And so it's a sheltered outdoor living space. And they had one, and that's where their pool was, which, seems excessive. But all right. Anyway, the real point was to let you know that Lanai, the Hawaiian island, is apparently 98% owned by Larry Ellison, who I think is the CEO he's the CTO and former CEO of Oracle Corporation. So a billionaire guy owns 98% of Lanai, which is in Maui County, if you were wondering about the location, there, or knew the vague-ish idea. If you had only even any sense of the boundaries of Maui County, Judy will know, but I don't. Anyway, so there you have it. There is one sort of settlement on the island, Lanai City. And I guess this is where this comes from. So the Lanai as a porch, it was, I guess, first popularized in Hawaii, but I don't know. Maybe let them have it. As far as I'm concerned, it sounds like a pretty nice invention, although it seems to me like most houses with front porches in the southeast of the United States, I guess, are kind of like lanais, but maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's not connected enough to the living space. So anyway, he owns the place, and that's amazing. And it is 20. What's the land area? Why is that not immediately obvious? 140.5 square miles, the sixth largest Hawaiian island, in case you were keeping track. And one guy owns most of it. The state of Hawaii owns the other 2%, and there are some private land holdings there. Anyway, I just thought that was rather remarkable. Now, back to Florida. The whole point of this connection was to tell you, A, I learned what a lanai is today, and B, that the hosts of ours shot the pool man when they heard noises coming from their lanai. And now you know. So Jana Hocevar, in case you were wondering, are these, elderly people who are cowering in fear over everything? And the answer is, it depends. How old are you? If you are 15, then you probably think that at 43, Jana Hocevar is elderly. But, I don't think so. But she saw an unfamiliar man within feet of the sliding glass doors. It was their last moments of life, these sliding glass doors, and called 911. The man turned out to be 33-year-old Carl Polek, who works for Bay Area Pool Techs and was cleaning the Hocevar's pool. However, as the sheriff told us last time we read this article, he had never shown up to clean the pool after dark and didn't specifically alert the people to his presence. Now, Bradley Hocevar, Mr. Hocevar, Lieutenant Colonel Hocevar, is 57 years of age, which, okay. He's, I guess, again, 15-year-olds would consider that elderly, I suppose. Well, he yelled at the supposed intruder to go away. And what's funny is that the supposed intruder did indeed go away. The problem is that he didn't hear anything that Hocevar was yelling at him for a couple of reasons. One, he had not yet shot out the plate glass in the sliding glass doors, which were still closed, which is one reason why he wouldn't hear you. And the other reason is that Polek had already left the pool deck in the Lanai to go and get a flashlight from his truck because he realized it was too dark to fill out the paperwork that he was supposed to leave there for the Hocevars to pay him. But they paid him in kind with 30 rounds of ammunition from their AR-15. So when Mr. Hocevar, Colonel Hocevar, saw the flashlight approaching the house, of course, the flashlight was going to drop off the bill for cleaning the pool. He said, "This is it. This is the apocalypse. This guy is a zombie." He was probably watching a zombie movie, and he's coming to kill us all. And so I got to get the AR-15 and fill him full of lead, even though he missed him 30 times. So how do you like that? When Bradley Hocevar saw the flashlight moving toward the house, he opened fire. Now, a little bit more detail in here that is also of some interest. The audio from the 911 call reveals. I'd love to hear that. Bradley Hocevar fired 2 rounds through the sliding glass door. That's not going to help very much. And then Polek ran away after the first 2 rounds, but the Hocevars could not see because the blinds were closed and they were taking cover behind their couch. Taking cover from what? The flashlight, of course, the deadly, deadly flashlight beam. They have, of course, imagined that they were being invaded by El Chapo's drug fiends, and they were probably better armed than they were, and this AR-15 would be of no use to them against this or the dragon that might be coming through the window, or, oh my God, there's a derailed train going to plow through our sliding glass windows. It's not a flashlight, it's a beacon of death, and we have to fire immediately. So, again, he's now firing at, I don't know who that is for sure, and the door's closed and the blinds are closed. And, you know, that's just one of those things that you're not going to be able to see when the blinds are closed. That's why they call them blinds. And, I mean, like, why not he should have just spun around in a circle and fired all 360 degrees through his walls to kill all of the invading troops that were certain to be surrounding his home at that point. But for some reason, he concentrated on the blinds and the window from behind the couch. And again, remember that the pool man, Polek, is in fact injured. He's cut by the flying glass from the door, which means he was pretty damn close. He was within a couple of feet of, according to this story too, he was within just feet of the house. And 30 rounds later, he's not hit even once. I just think that's the most remarkable aspect of the whole thing. Anyway, the 911 dispatcher on the phone and Jana Hocevar repeatedly pleaded with Bradley Hocevar to put down the rifle and stop firing. Both the 911 dispatcher and his wife. Please stop shooting. But no, 47 seconds after the first 2 rounds. And if there weren't the fact that these guys won't have any charges filed against them because Stand Your Ground has short-circuited that whole thing, that would come up at trial. I'm sure that the attorneys there, the prosecutors, if they were pressing charges against them, would tick that time off, like, hey, get out of here, and then pow, pow, and Polek runs away, and then they would tick it off, 47 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because when in a panicky situation like that, it's a long way to 47 seconds. And then 47 seconds later, after silence, when most normal people would have concluded there's no more danger, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Hocevar, USA retired, decided time to fire off another couple of rounds here. So his wife and the 911 dispatcher, please stop shooting. But 47 seconds after the first 2 rounds, Bradley Hocevar fired a few more rounds. Finally, about 25 seconds later, Bradley Hocevar unloaded his AR-15's magazine, meaning he fired 30 rounds in about 90 seconds, Gualtieri said. Gualtieri's the sheriff there, who's refusing to charge him, or says that he will face no charges. Polek sustained minor injuries from shrapnel and flying glass, but was not hit directly by the bullets. The sheriff, Gualtieri, said Florida's stand your ground law protects Bradley Hocevar's right to fire on someone he believed posed a threat to him and his wife. However, I will point out, they may want to look into, if there's a prosecutor, like a normal person there, they may want to look into this. Because remember, if they're stating it correctly here, the key is he has to believe that he posed a threat to him and his wife. But his wife is pleading with him to stop firing and put the gun down. She doesn't think there's any danger. That's a case right there. But he says 47 seconds later, I think there's still danger, and fires a few more rounds. And then waits 25 seconds and then just pop, 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 30 more rounds in 90 seconds. So I don't know. Now, they go on to say there was no crime committed, Gualtieri said. This is one of those situations we call lawful but awful. Gualtieri said Pollack agreed he probably should have warned the couple he was going to clean the pool after dark. Bullets from rifles travel long distances, we are reminded. And Gualtieri said it was lucky no passersby were injured. That's true. It is lucky. Deputies found stray bullets on the shuffleboard court behind the Hocevar home, which is, I would say, probably a common area. I don't know. Maybe they installed their own shuffleboard court. They seem a little young for that, but I guess it's possible. But it sounds to me like they basically fired into a common area that could easily have been occupied, though perhaps not after dark. The shooting is another in a recent series of cases in Florida and nationwide in which people have been shot or shot at because of mistaken identity, trivial situations, or other circumstances that have stirred controversy. That's the understatement of the year. The Hocevars could not be reached for comment at their listed phone numbers, and Pollack, reached on Facebook, said he needed to consult with his attorney before he could comment. Okay, wise counsel. That plus letting people know you're there, I suppose. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Well, what have we learned? One, I don't know what a Lanai is, but now I didn't. No, but now I do. And whatever. That's pretty much it. But yeah, they could probably. I wonder if there was an aggressive enough prosecutor there, and I have to assume that there is not one in Florida in that area. But they really should give some additional look at this. I don't know necessarily that this should count under. I don't think anything should count under stand your ground rules. Basically, I mean, it's something that you should be able to perhaps assert at trial, but I don't like this idea of saying, well, we can't even let a jury decide whether or not you were being reasonable because we can't even bring charges against you. I don't know. It seems to me that the circumstances would warrant it. And I think if you ticked off those 47 seconds and then the additional 25 seconds, combined with the fact that his wife and the 911 dispatcher are pleading with him to stop shooting, and he at no point at no point during the shooting does he actually have a visual on his target. and the fact that he sprayed bullets throughout a neighborhood, it makes me say, they should be looking at whether or not maybe they want to charge him with some reckless conduct at the minimum. All right. I mean, if he had shot someone, or if a neighbor indeed, finally shows up. I read this article today. I mean, I was tempted to just drop the whole thing, although I did want to know whether Lanai, no, I didn't know about the Lanai thing at all. But I wanted to see whether there was any update from neighbors coming and saying, they can't charge him with anything, but I want him to pay for the repair to my car, or Lanai, or carport, or, airport. I don't know what people have around their homes, these luxury homes with Lanais in Florida. But surely there was some damage elsewhere. Maybe the Neighborhood Shuffleboard Association wants repairs made to the shuffleboard court. I don't know. But no news on that so far. All right. That was not what I intended to spend the day on, but I had a feeling it would take me a long time to get through this article, because it's still just an unbelievable story, and that's why more and more outlets are picking it up and commenting, or running it in their pages, because people can't believe it. But they sort of hint at something at the end of the Tampa Bay Times coverage of it. They say, this is just one of a rash of similar. Look at it. We got some. This is helpful. Somebody with I don't know what, is a leaf blower. There's some gutter cleaning going on next door today, I believe. I heard it during the break. I heard him setting up the ladder. And of course, my first thought was to machine gun straight through the wall in case it was a zombie cleaning the gutters next door. We don't know. Maybe he's putting zombie dust in the gutters to F everybody up. Kill that guy. It's my right. Anyway, I couldn't find him, but I didn't see him, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be shooting at him, apparently. Anyway, I just thought that I would read that to see if there was any follow-up on damage to the area, but no. But they did give a sort of tip of the hat to the fact that this is just one of several such incidents. They were focusing, again, locally. And my whole gun fail thing has always been, you should be covering this as a national phenomenon, because, each one is a local interest story, but there's hundreds of them every day, and we should probably at some point confront the fact that we have a lot of maniacs in this country, and they're not just shooting up schools. They are lawful, law-abiding, home-owning, God-fearing gun owners, etc., who are just spraying bullets all around, intentionally or otherwise. And we should be keeping track of that. But we're not. Okay, and that reminds me of something else, which is, let's see, I have two recent pieces of correspondence. No, three recent pieces of correspondence. I had two when I started this segment, but I have a third one. The third one we'll start with because it comes related to this this story. It is from Morris Smith, who is Floridian, and says the town name is Dunedin. I mean, I'm sure you're right. That's one option I didn't consider, although I did try at the end of the break to Google it and see if there was a pronunciation guide, and I did see that it was like of Scottish origin, so it's named after, someone else's town. So the pronunciation could be anything. But Dunedin, Dunedin, Dunedin. I guess we might have been able to puzzle that one. Anyway, thanks to Morris for letting me know. I appreciate it. Other correspondence that I was planning on, but I'm glad I got that one. Let's see. One was, yes, it was gun related. That's why my mind went to it. From another, I think, first-time writer to the show, Paul McDonald, who is in Washington State. I don't want to give away your assassination coordinates, as Elon Musk would say. But thank you to Paul McDonald, who is mentioning that he's been a listener to the podcast for several years, so I appreciate that, which, of course, means we can call you Old McDonald, I guess. Not I don't know whether you really are or not, but you've been listening, an old listener, McDonald. Anyway, at any rate, he does, well, there's some explanation that gives some context to that. But the gun part of the correspondence is what was important. It was an interesting concept, and an interesting idea. As a non-lawyer, he offers this idea up, and I guess as a, not as a lawyer, but as someone who has passed the bar exam and is not practicing as an attorney, but I can give you some, I guess, insight into also having studied gun culture enough, whether or not this will pass muster. But he was saying that in particular, the gun fail compilations, that the ones we used to put together all the time on Daily Kos, are always informative and intriguing. Thank you very much. They have prompted me, Paul says, to contemplate a possible legalistic argument concerning the firearm carry laws currently so popular in the rabid right-wing dominated states. In simplicity, the decision any individual makes each morning, presumably, to tote a firearm is a prima facie indicator of intent to do violence upon a fellow human being. Oh, I see. Well, I just want me to comment along the way, or just, I guess I can. You could certainly present it as such. They would, of course, insist, no, the decision to tote a firearm each day is a prima facie indicator of my strong interest in preventing violence upon fellow human beings. After all, you sometimes merely need only brandish the weapon or produce it in some fashion in order to dissuade some other person from doing violence to you. They, of course, think of it as a defensive weapon, and so they would dispute that. And the current state of the law with regard to the fake Second Amendment that we mentioned yesterday, when we were reading somebody else's toot about it, is that, yes, the current court believes, thanks to the Heller decision, that there's a protected right to carry firearms daily for personal protection on the street. It's going to be very difficult to translate that and to square that supposed right with the idea that it's actually evidence that you intend to do violence to others. It's just not the way they think of it. So he goes on to say, well, basically, to sort of summarize things, that maybe this is something we should be looking at, and if only we were able to approach the problem from this different angle. The problem is we're up against people who just believe, as a starting point, think about guns completely differently from the way we do. But he goes on to say, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV, just like Greg's line. But I feel that this sort of analysis is important in the issue of gun violence in the country, and I offer this perspective to you for your advancement of the insanity of carrying firearms willy-nilly in this country. Well, we want to advance the idea that it is insanity, let's say, to do that. How an attorney might construct an argument presenting this point of view is not within my knowledge base, but perhaps you may know legal experts who could formulate an effective line of reasoning for this concept. I don't know if I know anybody who, specializes in that sort of thing. But I do know that, you would run into real trouble, because there are actually people who specialize in the opposite and who insist that the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment is everybody needs to be able to have that right to carry guns around with them wherever they go in order to preserve the peace. There's still people who believe in this idea of an armed society as a polite society. It's not really working out, but then there are also people who thought that a rising tide lifted all boats, and that didn't turn out to be true either. So there's a lot of conservative ideology that when it gets a road test fails pretty miserably, but sticks around for a long time nonetheless, because some people benefit from it, and then they try to nail that down as the status quo and make it legally binding thereafter. Ooh, now I have a segue to the other things that I wanted to get to. Okay, let's see. Well, there's a bit more here, too, by the way. A corollary to this point of view is a mental health perspective, that anyone who chooses to carry some form of firearm is suffering from either an asocial or antisocial mental affliction, since at the root of the choice to carry lethality is a desire to do harm to a fellow human being. Again, they do dispute that. as they would. But anyway, in this matter, I feel that the mental health profession, sociologists and psychologists needs to address this desire to carry firearms as a form of dangerous, asocial, or antisocial behavior and to expound it as such. They'd probably have a good argument, too, because the rest of the world lives pretty well, by the way, without this. And in fact, probably the places where you'd have the most reason to believe you would be shot by criminals on the street, there's probably not that much, well, there's certainly not much legal guarantee to access to firearms in some of those places. And meanwhile, some of the places where legal access to firearms are restricted to the greatest degree actually don't have a great deal of street crime going on. Anyway, the leaf blower thingy is back. I think that's what they're using to clean up after the gutter cleaning. All right. At any rate, I get the idea here. And I appreciate the sentiment, and it pays. Although I don't think it will catch on in court under current circumstances, do remember that getting to this point for the gun advocates was a decades-long project, during most of which it was considered insanity to think that the courts would ever come around to this conclusion. So right now, we're in a place where we could say, well, it's probably insanity to think the courts will ever come around to the conclusion that strapping on a firearm each day is in fact an indicator of a dangerous antisocial mindset. It's not impossible, because once nobody thought that there was any personal right to carry a firearm around with you under any circumstances without reason or without permit, for that matter. But now most of the courts in the country actually do. So it's not impossible. And of course, these things start with this kind of formulation, and then the question of, can we find people to push it into the mainstream? So you're not off base by any means. Thanks for writing in and letting us know about the way you think about it. And, there's a lot of people who agree and a lot of people who have similar sorts of ideas about ways to shift the paradigm, liability insurance that should be carried by gun owners, etc. It's the subject of a lot of similar thinking. Let's see. There was another piece of correspondence that I wanted to pass on to you that doesn't have anything to do with either of those subjects, but Roger Hake, who had passed this interesting tidbit on when the name Susie Wiles first surfaced in this past week. Greg mentioned her yesterday and reminded us that we'd heard the name before. Roger thought so as well, but was thinking of a completely different Susie Wiles, as it turns out. He says, I knew it rang a bell, but in a completely unrelated way, and which makes it perfect for this show, because everything should be unrelated, but related in a way. A search yielded this, and I was reminded of the connection for me. My sense is the New Zealand Susie Wiles is, or was, essentially the Anthony Fauci of New Zealand. Isn't that interesting? Who is Susie Wiles? Well, Susie Wiles of New Zealand spells her name, for one thing, like Susie and the Banshees style. Siouxsie, Susie Wiles. Though apparently that's an adopted variation of the name, because she was born as Susanna Wiles, but it's not a wild departure from Susanna. But anyway, she is a British microbiologist and science communicator. How do you like that? Her specialist areas are, this is an interesting combination, infectious diseases, got it, and bioluminescence. Okay, that's an interesting addition. Maybe that explains, she has a very bright, like, I don't know, would you say pink, magenta almost hair? So seems bioluminescent in a way. She is the head of the University of Auckland's Bioluminescent Superbugs Lab. And it sounds like she might have created that lab entirely by herself. And good for you. You must have got a lot of funding to do that one. Bioluminescent Superbugs. Do they have to be both? I don't know. But that sounds like some niche work. And I guess congratulations to Roger for being able to call that to mind. I would never have filed that one. Well, who knows what you file away in your brain, but he remembers who's researching bioluminescent superbugs in New Zealand. even if you don't. And that's the beauty of the show and our listener community. How do you like that? Okay. So, there was a segue in my mind somewhere, and now I forget what it was. So, never mind. We'll go back to Pocket. I had a whole other theme going today, and I wasn't entirely prepared for it, but we'll start with a basis that makes sense. Yesterday's ruling handed down from the Supreme Court on the affirmative action case, and I haven't had a chance to read through it, and I don't know, it's not the sort of thing that I would normally spend my time reading through, but I am pointed to something of interest and somebody who has, highlighted something in particular from the Ketanji Brown Jackson, not the dissent, because I don't think she participated in the case, although maybe she participated in the North Carolina portion of the case. But as I recall, we read yesterday that she had recused herself from the Harvard portion of the case. So maybe it's a formal dissent they're talking about, or maybe it's just comments on the side. I put aside a toot from Professor, let's see, I have to put this together from his various names here. K. Fuentes George. That's the username. And then he identifies as Professor Kemi FG. So Kemi Fuentes George, I suppose. Although I don't think his bio says where he's a professor, doesn't really matter. Professor is enough for me. And he calls out from this Jezebel.com article, which I have to read to you. Ketanji Brown Jackson skewers Clarence Thomas in SCOTUS's affirmative action ruling. So I guess, yes, she must have dissented in the North Carolina part of the case. Good, because I was hoping she would speak out. And when I saw she was recused from the Harvard part, at least, I thought we were missing out on some good commentary. But Professor Fuentes George here says, good news, fellow black people, giving away the game a little bit. So helping us identify where he's coming from here. The SCOTUS decision ending affirmative action doesn't apply to military colleges, military academies. So we're good enough to get shot to pieces in insert brown country here, but not good enough to go to an elite institution. Yay! I'd like to uncover what that is actually all about. And that struck me also as interesting. I want to read the Jezebel piece about how she's skewering Thomas's position and just see how crazy it really is. But, yesterday as I was pondering this whole thing, I remember way back in the early days of the pushback against affirmative action, the theory was, well, this is something we can seek to limit legally at public colleges, but perhaps we don't have as much leverage with the private institutions. But they found their way to doing it with the private institutions, although I also understand that in remarks yesterday, Joe Biden was basically saying, well, it's a little iffy how much they can really dictate to any college, for that matter, what they can and can't do. So, okay, take the decision for what it's worth, but find other ways then to bolster your efforts to increase diversity on your college campuses. There will be a way, and in fact, the Department of Education may help you in researching ways to do that. But perhaps you might consider all sorts of adversity that your applicants have faced in their lives, not all necessarily race-based, but perhaps some related to race. But that there was some way. There's still a way. Obviously, I think there still has to be the right available to admissions boards to design the classes, the incoming classes, the way they want to see them shape up. And there's really shouldn't be any real reason why the Supreme Court should be intervening in all of that, especially if they're about to tell another bunch of web designers and service professionals that they don't have to serve LGBTQ clientele if they don't want to. And I assume that they're about to tell them that again. Anyway, so that's interesting. And then I thought, well, of all the institutions that should be then least able to implement affirmative action, you would think the service academies would be the hardest ones to justify. And yet that one they left alone because I don't know why. I don't know what the reasoning was, but it was probably something to do with USA military. And then, leave it at that. And they can do no wrong. Just like we're going to have cuts across the board, but not for USA military. Well, we're going to eliminate affirmative action across the board, but not for USA military. Why though? Because the military, though, it must be telling them it's wise for us to do this. Whatever you say, sir. I'm going to now fire my AR-15 into my Lanai blindly because of my training. Anyway, Ketanji Brown Jackson probably has better things to say about this than I do. Skewering Clarence Thomas in this ruling. And then the subheader says, deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life, Jackson wrote in a blistering dissent, adding some special words for Thomas in a footnote. Susan Rincunas and Caitlin Cruz, if I've got their names right, or the byliners on this piece for Jezebel on Thursday. The Supreme Court voted 6-3 to gut affirmative action programs at universities. This disgraceful majority opinion, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, said higher education can no longer use race as an explicit factor when admitting students, as it may involve racial stereotyping. Ultra-conservative Justice Clarence Thomas used his concurring opinion to lament that affirmative action encourages, quote, permanent victimhood, and claimed that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had argued that the legacy of slavery locks blacks into a seemingly perpetual inferior caste. Yes, he really said blacks, not black people. Jackson responded in a footnote, Thomas does not dispute, he, I guess, or maybe this is my fellow justice, but they bracketed here. Thomas does not dispute any historical or present fact about the origins and continued existence of race-based disparity, nor could he. Yet is somehow persuaded that these realities have no bearing on a fair assessment of individual achievement. Jackson also wrote that Thomas ignites too many more straw men to list or fully extinguish here. Jackson had some words for the majority opinion, too. She wrote, with let them eat cake obliviousness, today the majority pulls the ripcord and announces color blindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. Now, the piece is then illustrated with a screen grab from the opinion, the dissenting opinion itself, tweeted around by Leah Littman, who says, wow, from KBJ's dissent in the affirmative action case, that's she highlighted what we just read, the with let them eat cake obliviousness today. There's more, but we'll do the digest version rather than just reading straight from the piece here. Okay. In his opinion, Roberts tried to have it both ways by allowing colleges and universities to consider race only when it's discussed in prospective students' essays. Nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. But despite the dissent's assertion to the contrary, universities may not simply establish through application essays or other means the regime we hold unlawful today, he wrote. But of course, they actually can, because there's no legal framework for showing that they did wrong, given that you said, well, sure, they can consider the essays. Anyway, weirdly, for some of the arguments for race-conscious admissions penetrated Roberts' little brain. He specifically exempts military academies and their potentially distinct interests from the ban that he's unilaterally applying to the rest of America. The United States, as amicus curiae, contends that race-based admissions programs further compelling interests at our nation's military academies. That was supposed to be broadly applicable to everyone, of course, but they were trying to show, yes, it's actually good for our military to have a diverse officer corps because it has a diverse enlisted corps as well. And you need, to allow us to be able to do that. But it was supposed to have been taken as more broadly applicable because essentially, like the graduates of the elite universities or really any universities in this country are the officer corps of the workforce, essentially. And it should have been understood that this was of value to everyone. It just wasn't. And they just basically, because their conservative brains say, military, sir, yes, sir. And then, you get whatever you want and the rest of you get nothing. But as he points out, the United States, as amicus curiae, contend that this is a good idea for the nation's military academies. No military academy is a party to these cases, however, and none of the courts below addressed the propriety of race-based admission systems in that context, Roberts wrote. This opinion also does not address the issue in light of the potentially distinct interests that military academies may present. I don't know how distinct they really are, if you think about things, but he doesn't. Justice Jackson saw right through Roberts' carve-out. The court has come to rest on the bottom line conclusion that racial diversity in higher education is only worth potentially preserving insofar as it might be needed to prepare Black Americans and other underrepresented minorities for success in the bunker, not in the boardroom. A particularly awkward place to land in light of the history the majority opts to ignore, she wrote in her dissent against the UNC case. She had, of course, as they know here, recused herself from the Harvard case because of her connection to the school. Not that any conservative justice would ever have done as much. Conservative activist Edwin Blum spearheaded lawsuits against affirmative action policies at both Harvard University and the University of North Carolina via his group Students for Fair Admissions. Lower courts held that the school's policies used race in a sufficiently limited way to fulfill compelling interests in diversity, per CNN, but plaintiffs argue that Harvard discriminates against Asian students, while UNC discriminates against Asian and white students. They're saying affirmative action is a form of discrimination. Blum has been at this for years. He also bankrolled both Abigail Fisher cases, decided in 2013 and 2016. Thursday's victory was obviously a great joy to Blum. Ending racial preferences in college admissions is an outcome that the vast majority of all races and ethnicities will celebrate. He's thankfully speaking for everybody. Thanks a lot. Blum said in a statement to the New York Times, a university that doesn't have real diversity when it simply assembles students who look different but come from similar backgrounds and act, talk, and think alike. A bright spot of the horrific decision is Justice Sonia Sotomayor's righteous dissent. In her dissent, the liberal justice rips into her colleagues, saying their opinion is not grounded in law or fact for an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. More from this and other things touching on the subject after our 1-minute break. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I want to pass on. I got this comment. Ricky's been listening. So did you hear me talking about PEI as well? But she chimes in on the Lanai thing and says a Lanai is like a patio. Now, this is the key part to it, is what she says. The Golden Girls had one. And that really is the key, because we've been discussing this at home. And I think the truth is that I think the terminology outside of Florida, apparently, it might be a little bit limited demographically, that you have to perhaps be of a certain age to even have it occur to you to refer to such a porch or patio as a lanai. But so really a good way of saying it is a lanai is like a patio. The Golden Girls would have been the kind of people who would refer to it as a lanai versus most of the rest of us, I guess. But anyway, I thought that was of some interest. Maybe that's it. If you watched the Golden Girls, you would have heard them say that did they mention it? Did they call it a lanai? I don't know. I never watched the show, and I can't imagine that was a central plot issue. But still, yeah, maybe that's it. And I'm trying to think of a similar example where people of a certain age will refer to it as XYZ. Like if you're watching Turner Classic Movies, there might be lanais, but otherwise, they probably don't mention it that way. I don't know though. And I guess my thoughts immediately went to telephones, because that's changed so much. Where even when I was a kid, when we were growing up, though there were still rotary phones around, the touch tone phone, which is another terminology, by the way, that I think probably kids have no idea, like a touch tone phone. That terminology, very 70s, touch tone. Anyway, but they still would say to you on a commercial, that you should dial such and such a number. And there hadn't been a dial, people weren't dialing anymore, but they were using, so the terminology, rotary phone, touch tone phone, I don't know. But that's just the example that came to mind. There's a better one out there, I'm sure, for Lanai. Anyway, we're going to continue on with the reading of the various dissents and related issues. And then Ricky had a comment on that as well. She's been listening to this segment. So, as we said, we left off that there was a bright spot in Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent as well. We quoted from it a little bit here, but there's a little bit more. Sotomayor's fire was joined by Jackson's dissent, where Jackson specifically called out Justice Thomas, who used his concurring opinion to wax on about how white kids today shouldn't be punished for Jim Crow laws. It should be noted here that while Thursday's decision was immediately seen as a blow to non-white students in the admissions process, white women are actually historically the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action policies, and legacy admissions inherently favor white people. So, let's see, another embedded tweet here. Some of her Sotomayor's strongest opinions are against racial profiling. She invokes her colleagues' hypocrisy on the issue here. The result of today's decision is that a person's skin color may play a role in assessing individualized suspicion, but it cannot play a role in assessing that person's individualized contributions to a diverse learning environment, she wrote. In other words, the court was saying you can't use race for admissions processes in colleges and universities, but police can still use race when it comes to sorting out who they suspect of crimes and want to stop and frisk on the street these days. They love to preserve that right for the police, but deny it to colleges and universities. And that is a tremendous irony. Unless, of course, you come to the realization that, a lot of the system's more or less been built for that. And it's no mystery how you could come out with that particular contradiction in mind, as it's drummed into your head over and over by everything you see everywhere in this society. So, okay, but a good point. That indefensible reading of the Constitution, she continues, is not grounded in law and subverts the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection, which is how they ended up ruling on this case. Curiously, they found the 14th Amendment meant the exact opposite. Sotomayor, who was joined by Justices Elena Kagan and Jackson, again only in the UNC case, wrote, "The court's majority opinion is indefensible and will further entrench racism. Ignoring race will not equalize a society that is racially unequal. What was true in the 1860s and again in 1954 is true today. Equality requires acknowledgement of inequality," Sotomayor wrote. And well done there. Back to the commentary, Ricky had asked, says, I don't understand why race should be a factor when determining whether a person should be admitted to a university. Shouldn't a person be selected by merit? If you qualify for a school, why should your race matter in your qualifications? And I think the answer that's traditionally given here, and it's interesting that it comes from a Canadian, because I did see an interesting comment about Canada's more inherent understanding of why there would need to be something like affirmative action. I wish I had grabbed that tweet today, but I'll say it this way. Harvard and most other universities that are in the focus for things like this have tens of thousands of applications and probably get thousands of applications for each slot that they actually have open on their campus and available, and thousands of qualified students for each one. And so they should be selected by merit, and they do begin that way. Then the question is, of the 100,000, well, no, I'm exaggerating numbers, of the 10,000 qualified students who we would consider for admission to the school, which ones should we choose? They're all qualified. And I think the initial crying about affirmative action was this person shouldn't have gotten in. They only got in because of affirmative action. They don't qualify. But that time, probably was never even with us at all. But if anything, it's long, if it would ever existed, it's long past. But they are usually admitting it's just a question of which properly qualified people will they admit. Now, if they went strictly by meritocracy, you would then ask the question, by what metric do we measure the merit? And if the answer is SAT scores, for instance, everybody's kind of increasingly coming to the conclusion that SAT scores have racial bias built into them in various ways, that they're culturally biased, that they, of course, they give advantage, and I guess some would say unfair advantage, to those who can, say, afford expensive SAT tutoring. And that often has racial implications because it has socioeconomic implications, and socioeconomic implications, those divisions very often follow racial divisions for reasons we've gone into that you don't even need explained again, but that have been historical in this country. When I had read about Canada, somebody asked, well, why don't we have this affirmative action controversy? Why doesn't this arise in Canada? And the point was, and I don't know this offhand, so I'm taking their word for it, but they were saying that essentially, is it in the Canadian Constitution or in the founding documents, the founding philosophies, or at least the current legal underlying philosophies adopted in Canada, a built-in system of recognition for, say, First Nations, and but also just noting that they gave an outright and affirmative legal standing and legal basis to programs aimed at ameliorating existing and prior prejudices and social divisions, and that there's an on-the-record legal affirmative defense of the idea of trying to implement programs aimed at ameliorating historical biases. And we don't have that, apparently, or at least haven't had it for long enough for this court to agree that it's worth something. So I don't know. I mean, that's a big difference. But yeah, essentially they're basically saying, well, we could take only the people with the highest SAT scores or the highest grades or the most achievements or what have you and leave it at that. We could, but we could also build a place that's more diverse culturally, racially, etc., that's built on, one, having it reflect the actual demographics of the country, if that's what they're after, and say, can I find 15% of the student body that could be admitted here who are African American, who are Black Americans, who have achieved at least, some certain very high standards in school and on the SATs and other admissions tests, but not necessarily the very highest ones in the country. They could make a class out of only people who got 1,600 on the SATs. There's enough kids, I guess, who've done that they could do that. But is there an argument to be made that if that were to result in an all-white class, would we be doing better for the students themselves and the university and the country as a whole by doing that? Or would we be doing better by saying, well, you know what? We should have 10, 15% or whatever of the kids be of Black American heritage, but they only got 1580. You know what I mean? Like, maybe we should allow for getting a little bit less on the SATs if you're a brilliant student with tremendous potential and who can add a lot to campus life and you're Black. That might be a good thing. And it might not be considered lowering our standards to say, well, somebody else got an additional A, and so we should let them in. But they got an additional A, but it's another Trent Worthington the fourth. Do we need another one of these? Because this is amazing. These two Trent Worthington the fourths are going to have to fight over which one of them is the real Trent Worthington the fourth. Because there's actually 7 of them that we admitted this year. You see the idea? Like, should we be getting out of the way of these, of ourselves and admitting a more diverse class that are still entirely qualified. That's the usual argument. And then other people say, I don't understand. I got a 1580. That guy got a 1570. How come he got in and I didn't? But that's been going on in colleges since forever. And it happens all the time, and even more to the extremes with the legacy admissions. That's why that always gets brought up. I don't understand why you deserve to be here and I don't deserve to be here. What about the legacy admission who got a lower SAT score than I did? And I got kicked out and that guy got let in. Why did that happen? And, none of it is meritocracy entirely, but it all begins with meritocracy. And then it's a question of putting together the right mix of players from that point on. So usually it's very rare, I think, in modern practice that they say, well, we just need some people of diverse backgrounds. So just pick them based on that. And then, hopefully they have some qualifications. I think everybody kind of gets admitted on, or screened initially with some eye toward the meritocracy of it. And then after that, in putting together the class at a granular level, they begin to look at background and diverse circumstances, and not just race. But sometimes race is a proxy for some of these things and sometimes not. But anyway, I think that might begin to answer the question. But also, essentially, at bottom it's the amazing thing that the conservatives on the courts are the ones saying, let's meddle in the internal processes of these private or quasi-private institutions and the way they put together their classes in a way that they think is best for their community and best serves their student body. And for the Supreme Court to say, federal courts should probably be meddling in this, for conservatives is pretty amazing, especially if they're going to tell you, as I think they might today, that that's the conservative view of these things is the reason why we're going to stick to that and say it's the reason why you can't tell web designers and cake bakers that they have to take LGBTQ clients. And so they'll hold both opinions at the same time, which that's just what they do. So, related to the affirmative action case, I had a couple of other interesting things to share that might make a theme out of it. And you'll see where we're going with this. So, I saw something the other day and I thought, oh, interesting, but not something I would put aside for the show. And then I saw something this morning that I said also interesting, but I also probably shouldn't put it aside for the show. But if I did, I could put it aside with this other thing, and then we could make a theme out of it. As I opened up my tabs this morning, and one of the things that happens, I think, when I'm opening Google and my Firefox is I think it talks to what's going on in Pocket. And anyway, it has story suggestions, and sometimes they work out pretty well and sometimes not. So today's suggestion was something that I ordinarily would have said, well, I can imagine what's in this. Maybe I don't need to read it. 5 things people still get wrong about slavery. And I thought, most people probably understand slavery by now. I wonder what they think the 5 top things are. And will I be shocked by any of them? It's from Vox. Vox asked historians to debunk slavery's greatest myths. Karen Turner and Jessica Machado did the asking, I guess. And I'm curious to see what are the things that people are getting wrong and why. And am I getting any of them wrong? And I thought it was a good follow-up, perhaps, to give some historical context to the affirmative action decision. And I have another thing that was waiting in the wings, too. Maybe we can make an even bigger theme out of it. In August 1619, that forbidden number, the first ship with 20 and odd enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of Virginia. 400 years later, we look back at this moment as the start of an enduring relationship between the founding of the United States and the unconscionable exploitation of the enslaved. In a sweeping project published by the New York Times Magazine in August of 2019, exploring the legacy of slavery, Nicole Hannah Jones wrote, The enslaved and their descendants transformed the lands to which they'd been brought into some of the most successful colonies in the British Empire. But it would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of black people to the vast material wealth created by our bondage. Black Americans have also been, and continue to be, foundational to the idea of American freedom. Yet, centuries later, the lasting impact of slavery continues to be minimized and myths continue to flourish. For instance, there's the erasure of the many slave revolts and rebellions that happened throughout the nation, perpetuating the lie that the enslaved were docile or satisfied with their conditions. There's also the persistent idea that black labor exploitation is over, when mass incarceration still keeps millions of black Americans behind bars and often working for, quote, wages that amount to less than $1 an hour. Then there's the idea that our understanding of slavery is accurate based on what we learned in history textbooks, when in reality, misinformation continues to be taught in our public schools about slavery's legacy. To unpack what often gets mistold or misunderstood, we asked 5 historians to debunk the biggest myths about slavery, and here's what they said in their own words. Before I get to that, even though I should get right to it because they're experts, I wanted to point out, I guess, in the affirmative action context, I wondered whether they considered at all and whether they thought it would be relevant and how they would have come down on it, given how they came down on the question of the military academies. Did they consider the now established and growing trend in our oldest institutions of going back into the history and seeing how slavery actually directly impacted the growth of the university? Like, for instance, at Georgetown, I know they just recently did this, and many others as well. I don't think Georgetown was the first, but it's one that comes to mind right away because it's one of the more comprehensive stories about it, which I read, in which they went back and they basically said, the question here is, are we where we are today? How much of where we are today is due to the exploitation of the enslaved? Georgetown University, for instance, that there were many, back in their oldest days when, and of course we're talking about, pre-Civil War when slavery was still legal in the area. What were the founders of this university, whether it be Georgetown or any others, or the, part of the establishment, caste that perpetuated it, whether you're talking about Harvard, which was already well established by this time, or anywhere else, were the benefactors that made these elite universities what they are today. In fact, made them elite in that day. In 1850s, 1840s, there were already elite institutions because there were very few colleges. Every university was pretty much an elite institution at that point. But they were very often endowed with large gifts, donations from the day's richest people. And were they the richest people because they had gone to Harvard, or were they the richest people because their families exploited the slave labor, which made them rich enough to be able to afford tuition to a place like Harvard? And from then on, it snowballs, whatever. Or in the case of Georgetown, there were wealthy benefactors whose donations to the college, to the university, was in fact enslaved people. That was property that you could deed to others and grant to others in your will, and they did that, and the university inherited essentially some number of dozens of enslaved people as bequests from alumni who had who died or who donated them to the for whatever reason donated people to the university, and then at some point they put them to work, which was an exploitation, but they also sold a number of the people. And who knows, the slaves selling at the time, they may have been doing all the horrible things you don't want to acknowledge happened, breaking up families and selling slaves this direction and that. And, generally treating them as enslaved people and then profiting from it. And that becomes part of the wealth base of these universities who now have these massive endowments. And a lot of it is due to the fact that they were able to sell people and bank the money from it. And you wonder, now some of these universities are trying to remedy some of that. One, acknowledge that they did that and acknowledge the role that slavery played in building it into the elite institution it is. And they're doing research, trying to find the descendants of the people that were enslaved and gifted to these universities and then sold for profit. And to the extent possible, offer admissions and tuition assistance so that the descendants of the slaves that were sold for profit by these institutions can get at least the educational benefit. Is like the least they could be doing. Is there any point at which the majority would have addressed that in this case, or would they? Is this the sort of practice that they would say, well, no, that's an unfair, this is something that's available only to black people. White people are entirely excluded from this because none of them, presumably, although, there's all sorts of, plenty of opportunity over the generations to have had some, white, let's see, on a willing basis to have mixed children, as opposed to the likelihood that some of the people who were enslaved and then sold were of mixed race as well. That's certainly a possibility. But anyway, they would probably, in one context, look at this and say, this is the worst kind of discrimination. But at the same time, I think that even some of these conservative justices would have to acknowledge, well, this is a special circumstance. But even if they don't acknowledge it, it should have been addressed as part of the argument because, of course, the whole basis of the affirmative action concept to begin with is, well, yes, it may have happened generations ago that there was slavery, and it now approaching generations ago that Jim Crow laws were in effect. Not very many generations, sometimes zero. But the question should always be asked. People who say, I had nothing to do with it, don't look at me, it's not my fault. Well, okay, it's not your fault, but the real question is, are you where you are today in a position to have elite prep school experience, elite SAT exam prep experience, et cetera, the ability to pay for extraordinary sorts of extracurricular activities that make you an exceptional candidate to admission to Harvard? How much of the money that paid for that might have its origins in the exploitation of human labor, a human slave labor? And the answer very often is probably a lot for a lot of you. And we'll get to that if we get to the connected story that follows this one. But now, between now and the break, and then of course a little bit after the break, we'll hear from actual experts who say what we misunderstand about slavery. And first, the myth that slaves never rebelled seems like an important one. Miseducation surrounding slavery in the U.S. has led to an elaborate mythology of half-truths and missing information. One key piece of missing history concerns slave revolts. Few history books or popular media portrayals of the transatlantic slave trade discuss the many slave rebellions that occurred throughout America's early history. C.L.R. James's A History of Pan-African Revolt describes many small rebellions, such as the Stono Plantation insurgents of September 1739 in the South Carolina colony, where a small group of enslaved Africans first killed 2 guards. Others joined them as they moved to nearby plantations, setting them afire and killing about 24 enslavers, especially violent overseers. Nat Turner's August 1831 uprising in Southampton, Virginia, where some 55 to 65 enslavers were killed and their plantations burned, serves as another example. Enslaved Africans resisted and rebelled against individual slaveholders and the system of slavery as a whole. Some slipped away secretly to learn to read. Many simply escaped. Others joined the abolitionist movements, wrote books, and gave lectures to the public about their experiences in captivity, and others led or participated in open combat against their captors. Omitting or minimizing these stories of rebellion helps hide the violent and traumatic experiences enslaved Africans endured at the hands of enslavers, which prompted such revolts. If we are unaware of resistance, it is easier for us to believe the enslaved were happy, docile, or that their conditions were not inhumane. It becomes easier then to dismiss economic and epigenetic legacies of the transatlantic slave system. That The commentary of Dale Allender, an associate professor at California State University at Sacramento. Second, the myth that house slaves had it better than field slaves. While physical labor in the fields was excruciating for the enslaved, clearing land, planting, and harvesting that often destroyed their bodies, that didn't negate the physical and emotional violence enslaved women, and sometimes men and children, suffered at the hands of enslavers in the homes. In fact, rape of black women, we've been over this, rape of black women by white enslavers was so prevalent that a 2016 study revealed 16.7% of African Americans' ancestors can be traced back to Europe. You know what that means? That means the white folks. One of the study's authors concludes that the first African Americans to leave the South were those genetically related to the men who raped their mothers, grandmothers, and or great-grandmothers. These were the enslaved African Americans within the closest proximity to and who spent the longest durations with white men, the ones who toiled in the houses of slave owners. A 2015 study determined that 50% of rape survivors develop PTSD. So imagine the impact of that across 20% of the black population.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. By the way, Darwin also chimed in about the pronunciation of Dunedin, but I missed that one. But identifying himself as senior Florida correspondent, I thought, I don't know, have always been in Florida, or did you used to live in Florida? I had a picture of you in being a Maryland correspondent for some reason. I thought you had mentioned that. All right, well, you can be from both. It's entirely possible. But I wanted to acknowledge that he had chimed in on this one too. Thanks to everybody for doing that. You know, it's hard sometimes to see it all in real time, but I appreciate you responding in real time on the off chance that I might actually see it. But I do like to get around to those corrections where possible. Okay. I'm sure you might also be interested in the current topic as well. And, all right, I'm going to continue on with it because it's important stuff. And, I hint at that stuff all the time. I'm constantly astonished how much of the, I don't know if I should say astonished. I mean, rape is a terrible subject to have to deal with at all. And it's triggering for a lot of people. And, in certain circles, you can't even mention the word without saying first trigger warning is coming up here. So I understand why it's particularly difficult to discuss, and so I suppose I shouldn't be astonished that it's erased from the history and the discussion of the history of slavery. But it's a huge, huge part of it, and I keep bringing it up. And because we hide from it as much as possible, it makes it possible to say that it's radical or wild-eyed or crazy to say things like I tend to say about the Civil War, that whenever we talk about, would people be crazy enough to fight a second civil war now over nothing, over things that they're making up. And I realize, I sometimes say, well, we fought the first Civil War. We keep telling ourselves, well, it was about slavery. Well, it was. But in particular, for some proponents of slavery, the people who signed up to be, let's say, lieutenant colonels in the army of the Confederacy, these kinds of people would have been going to war. The elite would have been going to war for a very specific aspect of slavery, not just the economic aspects of slavery, though that was probably weighed heavily in their minds. But a lot of them were also going to war, agreeing to go to war in defense of the system that allowed them to keep sexual concubines, like actual sexual concubines, living in their home and in their backyard, and to enslave the product of those rapes as well, and to be able to profit from it at that and sell them or put them to work anyway, if that was to their advantage to do. You would literally say, we should go to war, because if I don't go to war to defend this, I'm not going to be able to just keep sex slaves around. And that would be bad for me. Okay. I think maybe we should acknowledge this from time to time. All right. So where was I? All right. The 5 things, the 5 myths. Well, this was one of them. Of course, we started with this idea of house slaves having it better than field slaves. Not true for the most part, and not true in particular, because it would often have been the house slaves most subject to this particular type of mistreatment. So then they pointed out that there was this study that about 50% of rape survivors develop PTSD. I'm surprised that it's that low, honestly. It's hard to imagine that enslaved and freedom-seeking African-American survivors of rape, female, male, can happen, right? Don't forget. Old, young, no matter their physical or mental abilities, that they did not experience further anxiety, fear, and shame associated with a condition they could not control in a situation out of control. Those African Americans with the most European ancestry, those tormented physically, mentally, emotionally, and genetically in the house, knew they had to get out. In fact, they fled the farthest. Southern whites are more closely related to blacks now living in the North than those in the South. That's real interesting. And, genetically provable, but we have a hard time talking about that aspect of slavery and what it really means. This was the commentary, by the way, of Jason Allen, a public historian and dialogue facilitator working at nonprofits, hospitals, and businesses in New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. The third listed myth, the myth that abolition was the end of racism. Well, that's a pretty dumb myth, but okay. A common myth about American slavery is that when it ended, white supremacy or racism in America also ended. I don't really even understand how that could be a common myth. I mean, even among white supremacists. Especially among white supremacists. White supremacy is gone. I know, because I'm a white supremacist. That doesn't make any sense. Recently, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, speaking of, offered a familiar variant of this myth when he said he opposed reparations, quote, for something that happened 150 years ago. To the Kentucky Republican, a descendant of enslavers, slavery simply was, and then it just wasn't, as though the battlefield had leveled the playing field when it came to race. But the truth is that long after the Civil War, white Americans continued to carry the same set of white supremacist beliefs that governed their thoughts and actions during slavery and into the post-emancipation era. In the South, especially, whites retained an enslaver's mentality. They embraced sharecropping and convict leasing to control black labor in the late 19th century, enacted Jim Crow laws to regulate black behavior in the early 20th century, and used racial terror to police the color line, to this day. In the North, whites also rejected racial equality. After emancipation, they refused to make abandoned and confiscated land available to freedmen because they believed that African Americans would not work without white supervision. And when African Americans began fleeing Dixie during the Great Migration, white Northerners instituted their own brand of Jim Crow, segregating neighborhoods and refusing to hire black workers on a non-discriminatory basis. Slavery's legacy is white supremacy. The ideology, which rationalized bondage for 250 years, has justified the discriminatory treatment of African Americans for the 150 years since the war ended. The belief that black people are less than white people has made segregated schools acceptable, mass incarceration possible, and police violence permissible. This makes the myth that slavery had no lasting impact extremely consequential. Denying the persistence and existence of white supremacy obscures the root causes of the problems that continue to plague African Americans. As a result, policymakers fixate on fixing black people instead of trying to undo the discriminatory systems and structures that have resulted in separate and unequal education, voter suppression, health disparities, and a wealth gap. Something did happen 150 years ago. Slavery ended. But the institution's influence on American racism and its continued impact on African Americans today, or is still felt today. I ruined the last line. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, responsible for that one, and associate professor at Ohio State, the Ohio State University, in fact. The myth that history class taught us everything we needed to know about slavery is number 4 on the list. Many of us learned about slavery in our middle or high school history classes, but some of us learned much earlier, in elementary school, through children's books, or even Black History Month curriculum and programs. Unfortunately, we don't always learn the entire story, and of course, those things are being targeted and taken away from us. Most of us only learned partial truths about slavery in the United States. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, many in the North and South wanted to put an end to continuing tensions, but this wasn't done just through the Compromise of 1877, when the federal government pulled the last troops out of the South. It was also done by suppressing the rights of black Americans and elevating the so-called lost cause of the enslavers. The lost cause is a distorted version of Civil War history. In the decades after the war, a number of Southern historians began to write that slaveholders were noble and had the right to secede from the Union when the North wished to interfere with their way of life, raping their slaves. To put it the most bluntly. I mean, you could put it in other ways, but that does usually help make the case if you're willing to say it. The North wished to interfere with their way of life, keeping concubines in the house and raping them and enslaving their children. I want to interfere with that way of life. I think that's a way of life that should be interfered out of existence. But, whatever. Due to efforts by a group of Southern socialites known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it should be United Daughters of Treason, but they styled it differently. Lost cause ideology influenced history textbooks as well as books for children and adults. The accomplishments of black Americans involved in the abolition movement, such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Maria W. Stewart, Henry Highland Garnet, and William Still, were downplayed. Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant were denigrated, as were anti-racist whites from John Brown to William Lloyd Garrison. Generations later, there are still many people around the country who believe the Civil War was about states' rights and that slaves who had good masters were treated well. Even an accurate historical curriculum. By the way, I should pause for a second. I know that's part of the last segment of myths, the idea of that slaves who had good masters were treated well. Just considering what was probably passed off as being a good master at the time is pretty amazing. Like, I treat my slaves well. I let them live in the house, or I give them extra whatever, food or treatment or consider. I take care of the ones, my favorites, where this is like the wink wink of the ones I treat the best are the ones I rape. Well, maybe they're the ones you actually treat the worst, but it's actually treating them good. My house is a good house. It's a rape house. It's a good house for you. You're not getting raped in it. And I treat them good. I let them live inside the house, and I take care of them, and I give them special gifts because I feel sentimental about raping them so many times. Whatever it is, it's just like maybe it really wasn't good. You think it's good because you're you and you didn't get raped. And even if you think about what you're doing with your slaves, you probably think it's a big gift to them. After all, I'm not whipping them and making them pick cotton. I'm making them do this other thing. Think about what this other thing is. Anyway, I'll go on with this. Even an accurate historical curriculum emphasizes progress, triumph, and optimism for the country as a whole without taking into account how slavery continues to affect Black Americans and influence present-day domestic policy from urban planning to health care. It does not emphasize that 12 of the first 18 presidents were enslavers, that enslaved Africans from particular cultures that enslaved Africans from particular cultures were prized for their skills from rice cultivation to metallurgy, and that enslaved people used every tool at their disposal to resist bondage and seek freedom, another of the myths. But this one sandwiched in between is an excellent example that once again, enslaved Africans from particular cultures were prized for their skills from rice cultivation to metallurgy. Valuable skills that this country absolutely had to have in order to grow, and that were not only exploitable and were exploited, but what this means, of course, is, we were just enslaving savages who were living in huts, and we gave them a better life here in America. No, they understood rice cultivation better than you did, metallurgy better than you did. And so you said, let's bonk them over the head and steal them and make them do that for us for free instead, as opposed to let's trade with these metallurgists and buy the best metal crafted objects or whatever have you, or trade with them for the rice that we want. No, we want to grow the rice and sell it. We want them to grow it for us for free. That's what we're going to do. It wasn't, we were just taking them away to a better life from off of the dark continent. Like, they were an actual culture and they did things better than you did. So you made them your slaves. That's not great. Anyway, back to the rest of this. Given what we learn about slavery, when we learn it, and how, it is clear that everyone still has much more to learn. Teaching tolerance and Teaching for Change are two organizations that have been wrestling with how we introduce this topic to our young, and what they're learning is that the way forward is to unlearn. That from Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And then the last one, number 5 on the list. There are many more, I'm sure, but this is what's on the list. The myth that slavery doesn't exist today. One of the greatest myths about slavery is that it ended. In fact, it evolved into its modern form, mass incarceration. The United States has the highest prison population in the world. More than 2.2 million Americans are incarcerated. 4.5 million are on probation or parole. African Americans make up roughly 13% of the general population. But Black men, women, and youth have outsized representation in the criminal justice system, where they make up 34% of the 6.8 million people who are under its control. Their labor is used to produce goods and services for businesses that profit from prison labor. For those of us who study the early history of mass incarceration in America, these statistics are not surprising. From the late 1860s, and what happened around then, through the 1920s, over 90% of the prison and jail populations of the South were Black. Now, by the way, there are still people who will defend this and saying, well, they were criminals, you see. It's not, and it's not even, they might even be like enlightened and say it's understandable that they would turn to crime. After all, the economic system that they had lived under for all of this time, and that at least provided for their survival, was abolished, and now they had to survive through whatever means necessary, and perhaps many of them turned to crime, but society can't tolerate that, and so therefore, and yes, of course, there were very few white criminals incarcerated, but that was probably because they had other opportunities available to them to provide for themselves rather than resorting to crime. That would be one type of explanation, sometimes offered by semi-enlightened folks, sometimes, schemers. But then again, we just have to sort of go back to, well, what are we talking about here? Crime. Like, how do you define it? Like, for instance, while stealing bread is an easy thing to define as a crime, even when it's absolutely necessary for survival, and some more enlightened societies may say, well, let's not, at least not punish it this way with incarceration and hard labor. But remember that defining things as a crime is a policy choice as well. Sometimes we don't think of it that way, but 10 years earlier than this decision to criminalize all black activity was made, it was not a crime to rape dozens of captive women in your house. Now, why weren't there many people incarcerated in the South for raping dozens of women at a time and holding them as sex slaves? Well, it was a different time. I mean, that's super pathetic as an excuse, but that's the real answer. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that one out there again because I can't get over that. Who could ever get over that concept? Anyway, back to the commentary, though. Thousands of incarcerated men, women, and children were hired out by the state to private factories and farms for a fee. From sunup to sundown, they worked under the watchful eye of brutal whipping bosses who flogged, mauled, and murdered them. They earned nothing for their toil. Today, labor exploitation, the denial of human dignity, and the right to citizenship, family separation, and violent punishment define our criminal justice system in ways that mirror slavery. Hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people work. According to a 2017 report published by the Prison Policy Initiative, the average of the minimum daily wages paid to incarcerated workers for non-industry prison jobs is now 86 cents. Those assigned to work for state-owned businesses, correctional industries, as they call them, earn between 33 cents and $1.41 per hour. In 2018, incarcerated Americans held a nationwide strike to end prison slavery. In a list of demands, striking individuals called for all persons imprisoned in any place of detention under United States jurisdiction to be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. This is a year to remember slavery's origins. It is also an opportunity to critique its legacies. Let's not get so caught up in our efforts to commemorate slavery's beginning that we fail to advocate for its end. That the work of Talitha LeFloria, if I have the name pronounced correctly, the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor at the University of Virginia, right here in Virginia. Yes, the capital of the Confederacy. That's right. Okay. So moving on to other things that I wanted to include in this wide-ranging segment. But first, an update. I wanted to let you know that I have seen that, yes, the Supreme Court has, in fact, handed down its ruling, and as expected, will be ruling in favor of the web designers who didn't want to serve LGBTQ clientele, every bit as hypocritical and ridiculous as you believed it would be, and that's the news. Okay, so other things I wanted to include, something else that I had pocketed or seen and thought was interesting and didn't pocket, that now I feel like I have to, that helps illustrate some of the point. Reuters published a very interesting piece the other day. I thought they were stretching the point a little bit with some of this stuff, but the idea was I'll give you their, they got to show me their graphic first, before I can get to their title. Where do they put the title in this thing? Among America's political elite, Reuters found that 5 living presidents, 2 Supreme Court justices, 11 governors, and 100 legislators descend from ancestors who enslaved black people. This piece, I guess the title would be America's Family Secret here. The idea was, and maybe did they put it better in the headline that was in pocket here, more than 100 U.S. political elites have family links to slavery. Now, if you think about that, it probably should surprise no one. It wasn't that long ago that slavery existed. You can trace the ancestry of a lot of these folks back, but it takes a lot of research. 1, to do their family trees, and then 2, to see whether there's records of their having been slave owners. When I say they stretched some of the things, I would say some of the people that they included here, it's difficult to define them as political elites. Like, for instance, I just was thumbing through this, and some of them were former members of Congress. And one in particular, I just thought it was interesting. A former member of Congress, one-term member of Congress. It actually happens to be Carolyn Bordeaux, whose name has been called once or twice on the show. One of the Democrats elected in, 2000? When did she get first elected? in 2020 and then lost in 22, or was it 18 and lost in 20? Got primaried out, gerrymandered into another Democrat's district, Lucy McBath, I think, and was that so? A one-term member of Congress, I don't know about whether they're political elites, but they're more politically elite than me, right? And me and you. So why not? But really the point was, one, demonstrating these links. Two, they were very careful in pointing out, by the way, that the slave owner in question, how many people were enslaved, sometimes very few, doesn't really matter, but they had enslaved people. And in some cases, 5 and 6 generations ago. And so I just bring this up to help deal with the point of that very often is made. Well, this is not my fault. I had nothing to do with it. And it's true. It's not your fault. And you didn't have anything to do with it. And it was maybe 4, 5, 6 generations ago where someone was at fault. Of course, they didn't believe they were at fault back then. But okay, now we understand that they were. But really, this goes to the question of, okay, what we really need to look at here in the context, particularly of affirmative action in that case, is how is it that there's so often this weird coincidence where 5 and 6 generations ago, somebody enslaved people, and now you are a member of the United States political elite? In other words, is there no connection here? Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers who were slaveholders, and there were very many of them. If you ever tour Monticello or whatever, or just read a history, or just read a little bit of biography of Thomas Jefferson, all the amazing things that he did, things he invented, writings, he was all over the place and a very accomplished person by all accounts. But if you stop and think about things like, if you never had to worry about food, where am I going to get my next meal? Who's going to cook it for me? Like, if you have all of your needs taken care of, somebody's going to make my bed, clean my clothes, tailor them. They're going to provide me with the clothes. They're going to provide me with food. All my worldly needs are taken care of. That leaves me all day long to do wonderful thinking, sometimes about other stuff, or inventing, or bestowing gifts on a university and establishing a university, or writing about the inherent freedom of man, or whatever it is, because I have slaves who will do all this stuff for me. My days are free for lofty thoughts and inventing. And that makes me rich in many ways. Now, sometimes they squandered their money, and not everybody became a Thomas Jefferson, of course. Sometimes they were just a bunch of ignorant rich people. That happens too today. But I guess so the real question I think that's confronted by this piece is, are you here today? Are you a member of Congress, or were you once a member of Congress, a member of the political elite, or wealthy? You have all sorts of opportunity available. Even if you're a one-term congressperson, you're now on to something else in some other prestigious job. And the question is, did you get there because there was some generational wealth passed on, because that generational wealth was created by enslaving people? At some point, it's not your fault, but do you acknowledge that you are where you are today, possibly because of the fault that existed way back when? And it's very interesting to think about as you are reading through this list of people who are identified as having slaveholding ancestors. And it's interesting. It's also interesting how people responded to it. It tended to be the case that Republicans, when, asked for comment about it, just didn't respond. Occasionally there were some who did. Lindsey Graham, for instance, I guess couldn't avoid it entirely, and he thought he had some sort of interesting spin to put on things. Then, of course, there are certainly Democrats on the list, certainly Democrats who didn't respond. Then there are others who say, who put on the expected show. Well, it was a shameful period in our history, and I fully acknowledge, and this, it's interesting just to watch the differences. But, it's also interesting to see the people identified. Like, for instance, Lindsey Graham. What are we talking about? His direct ancestor, who was a slaveholder. 8 slaves held in bondage by Joseph Maddox. the great-great-great-grandfather of Lindsey Graham. And I see they've changed the format here to when I saw it initially, it said the number of generations ago that it was. And they translated that for people. Like, it wasn't making so much sense anymore. 5 generations. Well, I know that's a lot of generations, but what is that? Well, that's a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather in this case, or 6 generations. Because the next person up was Tammy Duckworth, in case you were wondering that, how diverse is the group of Democrats involved. Anyway, a fascinating read. And in many cases, they identified the names of the enslaved people because they're entered in ledgers, which is an amazing way to find out that you're actually going to be identified by name. Yay, I was identified by name. Boo, it was on a property ledger. Okay. Well, at any rate, it's an extremely interesting read, and an extremely interesting thing to consider in light of what just happened with affirmative action. Another thing, which I won't have time to read for, and I might not even have time to find it in my scrolling through pocket, but maybe Justice will indulge me in allowing to start the outro music late so that I can find this thing. I know it's in here somewhere, and I'll find it and I'll give it to you, even if I don't. I got to start the music anyway, just to get out of here and give Justice a chance to do things. But somewhere toward the beginning of the month, there it is. I knew I had it. The title was important all by itself. It was, and the author important all by herself, Simone D. Sanders Townsend, now writing this piece from the beginning of the month that Juneteenth feels a little heavier this year and increasingly important, saying, I can think of nothing more dangerous than the ongoing assault on our nation's true history. Just the idea that the second celebration of it as a federal holiday hit very differently this year, given that there are states trying to eliminate Black history wherever they can root it out. And that much makes it just that much more important, that much more imperative that we actually acknowledge some of the more important passages in Black American history as well. So I'm going to provide that for you to read. I'm sorry I couldn't get to it today. It is time for me to give up the microphone for the weekend and hand it over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Here's some of the things he has on tap. Of course, first up, maybe the reason the MAGA SCOTUS ruling that diversity is discrimination sounds like some deep Orwellian trolling is because it is. You knew he would be taking this topic up. Plus that, of course, and lots more from around the country and around the world. We all live together in the same world. We'll be back to comment on that and more.
You've been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
When will we be back? Beginning in July as we return for a new month. Okay, let's see. Yes, plenty of topics. I usually would have ended by now, but guess what he's got? China's manufacturing contracted in June as export orders decreased. And Ukrainian emergency workers held drills to prepare for radiation leaks from a Russian-held nuclear plant. Yes, I went beyond the music to bring you that news. We'll see you next week.